Unfortunately, we were almost there with the technology. I had hoped this would be the very first time we could beam someone in from the US into here. I do hold out some hope for when my laptop arrives from the committee meeting, but right now we can't connect this laptop that's driving this screen with Tessa. Tessa's so close, she's here. But Tessa, would you like to just say hello so that there's some evidence that you are there?
So that they actually believe it? Yes. Did that work? Great. I heard all of you.
Well, thank you, Tessa. So you can hear us fine?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Superb. You're coming out loud and clear here. How I run my study. It was one of the topics that's been most asked about in the membership survey that was conducted last year. What folks were asking for was, can you give us some hints, tips, guidance? Try not to be prescriptive about your approach. How do you do what you do in essence so that you, the audience, can make up your mind whether or not the way one person does their study matches yours, or if they've got an idea or an approach that you might find valid to try. So to that end, what we've done, and Tessa, you'll be up first, is that they'll be introducing some highlights about their studies so that you've got some ideas about what they're up to. In choosing the panelists, we've got one who I say has got a big one, one who one who has an Irish one, and one who has a French one. And between those three and myself, we have slightly different approaches to keep the conversation perhaps interesting. I do urge you, we're using the 7 pillars as a guide, so rather than look up what the 7 pillars are, if you think about questions during the course, then bring them to my attention, and I'll direct one of the questions, your questions, to one of the panelists if you prefer. Probably best to do that during the flow. You'll be here for the next 6 hours or so, so enjoy. Right, without any further ado, let the panelists, beginning with Tessa, introduce themselves and some highlights of their study. Tessa, if you could let me know when to click forward on the slides.
Sure. If you have the slide in front of you that has One Name Study and Keough on it, then you'll have a little bit of my information. First of all, I wanted to say good afternoon to all of you, although it's not even, the sun hasn't even come up on the west coast of the United States yet. So I'm happy to join you through the partial magic of Google+, and also the technical skills of Bob Cumberbatch and Colin Spencer. Now, I was told, or I saw, that the title for the Guild Conference is 35 years on, and I thought that's actually quite a feat, and I'm sure that there were few people in the Guild who envisioned that at this point in time we could get together on a worldwide basis at little or no cost to any of us. So I'm joining you from a distance of about 5,000 miles, a time difference of 8 hours, and I'm connecting via a laptop with a webcam. So technology has come a far way, not quite 100%, but we're almost there. I also wanted to say that I did not see the title for the panel until it was advertised. So a warning here, I'm not an expert. But as you may have gathered from the program notes, I'm going to be discussing how I run my One Name Study from the viewpoint of somebody who only recently registered their One Name Study and from a North American perspective. So we can go on to the next slide. When Bob Cumberbatch asked me to be on this panel, and he told us what we were all going to be talking about, he said to give you a little bit of a background. And so for my purposes, I started my one name study just about 2 years ago. And I've done most of my work online by finding indexes and records that relate to my grandfather's birthplace, which is in Newfoundland. And in fact, the reason I started collecting all the instances of the Keough surname was because I was trying to find our extended family. And I quickly determined that this project was going to be kind of a push me, pull you kind of animal. I wanted to find all of the instances of my surname, and in order to do that, and not being familiar with the Newfoundland area, I had to find all the instances of the Keough surname. Now, the idea of gathering data and then sorting through it was actually interesting to me, and I think it's because I come from a history background and also a legal background, and so I really enjoy getting into the records and doing the statistical analysis and trying to come up with some kinds of conclusions. So that really appealed to me. Now, from the start of my one name project, I knew that I'd have to expand my research out to ever increasing areas. And so my first expansion after the very small community in Newfoundland was going to be onward to Canada, the rest of Canada, and then moving to the United States. And after that point, I'd go to Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales, and then see if there were Keoughs anywhere else in the world. The reason that I did this was because I was familiar with American records, and I really immersed myself in the records of Newfoundland. And for each other place that I'm going to be doing research, my aspect of this is I'm going to have to find out about the record sets and the history and the culture first before I can really get in and try and connect families. At least that's the way that I approach it. The method I'm taking, or the locations that I'm going through, are also where our name first appeared in Newfoundland, and then where it goes forward, which is Canada and the United States, and then backwards to Ireland. If you want to go ahead and move the slide.
Done.
Okay, great. When I started, yeah, I'm following you. When I started to research the surname, I read everything I could online about surname studies, and that's what I was looking it up as. I had never heard of one name studies, and I stumbled into two things. The first was a Pharaoh's course, which was called Introduction to One Name Studies, and so being a student, an eternal student, I decided I would take that course because I would know the right way to do a one-name study. And of course, the first thing they told me is there's no one right way. So that threw me a bit. But the second thing that was really helpful was everyone was mentioning the Guild. And in fact, you could get 1-year membership in the Guild with your Pharaoh's course. So I thought, you know, what a great idea. Then I also went to the Guild website because everything that I saw when I did a Google search was talking about the Guild of One Name Studies. And so I decided early on to go ahead and join the Guild, even though I wasn't sure that I was going to register a study or even if I was going to end up doing it. The first thing I did, both from the course as well as reading through the 7 pillars, was determine the frequency and the distribution of my surname. And that's the type of thing you're seeing here. For purposes of our discussion today, I took a look at the 1880 and 2000 census for the United States and the 1881 and 2001 census for the UK and saw what the numbers were. And then for my purposes, I had to put it into perspective because I knew the total populations were completely different in both countries. And I knew that even though the number sounded like it had increased in the United States, you know, it didn't jive with the population. And so I worked a little bit with my rusty math skills to determine that in the United States, Keough actually makes up a smaller percentage of the population. It decreases by half between 1880 and 2000. And this was surprising to me. The Keough surname in the UK actually increases as a percentage of the population. I think it's a little over 5-fold. So everything's an education. It's the most commonly found in Newfoundland and Canada. And the reason I make that distinction, I'm sure some people would correct me, is Newfoundland did not join the Canadian Confederation until 1949. So a lot of the research that I've done has been when they were, you know, independent or actually a part of Britain. So I always refer to them separately, and a number of people in Newfoundland do as well. If you want to go ahead and move the slide.
Done.
Okay. Although I started collecting those instances of the Keough surname in Newfoundland in 2008, it was not until 2011 that I really focused on the one name study, and that was after I took the course. And it wasn't until 2013 that I actually committed and registered the surname, and that was also because the Guild changed their requirements just a little bit, so I felt that I could start out small and grow my study over time. About 90% of my files are in electronic format and about 10% are paper, and that's probably because I didn't start working on genealogy until about 2007. And I would say 75% of my research is online and 25% is in person. I actually spent about 4 weeks in Newfoundland, and I've, over the course of a couple of visits, spent about 8 weeks at the Family History Library. And although I currently work on the study by myself, there are 3 individuals, extended family members in Newfoundland, who help me with lookups and answer questions for me, and 2 individuals in the United States who also assist me by answering questions or giving me some additional resources. There's a Keough forum on Roots Web and a Keough DNA project run out of Ireland. However, those projects seem to be on a very low level of activity, or maybe Keoughs just don't ever respond to anything. I'm hoping that when I launch my One Name Study website in the fall, that will generate some greater activity or interest level. And we can move on.
Done.
Great. Okay. And then from online conversations, and from, looking through the 7 pillars and the rest of it, I realize that there are people who are strictly record gatherers and people who are strictly family reconstructors. And I am a little bit in the middle. I straddle that fence, so I call myself a path crosser because I use a little bit of both. But the way that I approach it, and Bob asked me about this, is I did start out going through all of the record sets and gathering the data before I started doing any kind of family reconstruction. And I have done this for 2 reasons. The first is that I needed to understand what the records were and where to find them, before I started playing around with trying to put a family together. And certainly starting with Canadian records, it's a little bit different than using American records or perhaps records from England. And the second reason was I was terrified that 1 million people were going to contact me once I registered the surname and ask me questions, and I wouldn't have any information for them. So I wanted to make sure that I did have some record sets or understood record sets in a variety of places, so I could at least direct people somewhere. And of course, what's happened is I think I've maybe received a total of 6 questions. I've been able to answer them or direct people, but it wasn't the flood that I was assuming. So in one sense, I think that's good. As far as the family reconstructions, I'm lucky in that Newfoundland has the 1935 and 45 censuses online and has had them, since they were provided and transcribed by a volunteer group. And so it's been very easy to find living people who can speak to earlier censuses or earlier records. And that's something that you don't get with countries that are much stricter on when they allow the information to be put online. Okay, we can go to the next slide.
Done.
And with the beauty of Excel, I put together the statistical analysis by going to Ancestry, and then I checked my numbers against Family Search to just find the instances of the Keough surname throughout the census years. So I did an exact search to do that, and this shows you what it's like in the United States. And as you can see, the Keough surname doesn't really pick up until that 1860 time frame, and that coincides with history, which would be the second wave of immigration from Ireland to the United States. Although, interestingly, we went to Newfoundland in about 1804 and stayed there until 1916, which is when we came to the United States. I would also say that my primary surname is certainly not by any stretch of the imagination the highest incidence of the Keough surname. It's much more common, Keough and Kehoe. So it's interesting to find how all of this works together. The next slide. I will also say that I did the statistical analysis for Ireland, Scotland, Canada, and the UK so that I would just know what I had ahead of me as well. And I took a quick look, as you can see, to see record gathering wise what I would have in front of me on a worldwide basis. This is another instance where I used Ancestry and did my surname with an exact search in the countries. And I have about 250,000 documents that I'm going to have to retrieve at some point, and that seems doable to me. And I took a quick look at all of the variants together with my primary surname, and that's almost 1 million, and I've decided that a quick look was enough for me. I'll come back to that later. And then finally, and we can move on from that slide, Bob asked us what tools we used. And I do use Legacy Family Tree, and I would say that it's because I started doing my genealogy, obviously, in the United States, and I had not even heard of Family History, and it's not, I would say it's not well publicized over here. And so I started with that, and I'm really familiar with it, and so I continue to use it. I have a Weebly website, but it's private at this point, and it's kind of in draft, and I'm getting there. And I'm hoping that, you know, once I get that up, I'll generate a little bit more interest. I do use Excel and OneNote. I find that very helpful for the record gathering, to have it in a format that you can easily filter and sort and move things around and really play with it. And I do use Evernote for actually going through, and I think it's easier with Chrome to just go ahead and clip things that you're looking at, or transcriptions that you find. I also use Transcript, which is a great program for abstracting or transcribing documents, because it keeps the document in one window and what you're working on in the second window. And then finally, I use Faststone Image Viewer, because a number of times, if I have a number of census records, it's easy to change the names if I need to, and do batch updates at one time. And so that's just a little bit, maybe too much, about how I started working on my study and the things that I use to do my study.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tessa. You've captivated the audience. Next intro, the French one.
As Bob said, mine is basically a French study. Echoey. Shall I hold it a bit further away? Is that better? No? No, the other mic's off. It's probably Tessa feeding back, is it? Yep. Is that any better? No. Now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, that's better. The one name that's missing from that slide is my paternal grandmother's name, which started me along this study, which is the anglicised version of Lefever, L-E-F-E-V-E-R. And that's the one, for some reason, I don't know why, I left off the slide. Very odd. Oh, that's why. You can tell how long ago I prepared these slides. Just an interesting aside, how the name changes through the years and how the variants arise. Lefever, for instance, you never see in Europe, but it seems to be the common variant that has turned up in the States. So it's just interesting little bits that I've found along the way. If we look at the 1881 census, only 429 people in the whole of the UK at the time. And if you look, you can see the split, 2/3, 1/3 between the anglicised spelling and the French spelling. 1880 in the States, pretty similar. But 2002 in the UK, the anglicised spelling is disappearing. Is that snobbery? People want to appear to be French and foreign and changing it backwards and forwards? I certainly know my grandmother didn't bother with which way she spelt it. Sometimes it was ER, sometimes it was RE. It was just how the fancy took her at the time. And finally, the US numbers for 2000, still only 12,000. So in those terms, it's a relatively small study, unlike my colleague to my right, who we'll talk about his in a minute. Why did I start my study? Basically, I'd reached a brick wall with my own family research and wanted to do something else different. I still drop back into my own ancestry at times, but I decided that the Lefever name was going to be quite interesting, given the history of coming to England as part of the Huguenot persecution. I started gathering names, and that lasted for a couple of months, and I thought, this is stupid. This is all it is name gathering, and it's not taking me any further. So, in fact, I've turned it on its head, and maybe that's what's taking my study longer to pull together, is now that I only do family reconstructions. I find a new Lefever that I haven't heard of before, and I then concentrate on that family, taking it as far forward and as far back as I can, before I move on to another one. It makes the study slower, but I think, for me, it makes it more interesting. My own genealogy, a lot of it's paper. However, the Lefever study has only started recently. It's pretty much 99.9% electronic. I've asked for volunteers, and to date, nobody has. So it's a solo study, solo piece of work for myself. On the table on the left shows the countries where I currently have records, and the vast majority of those are constructed into trees. I have been holding off on doing 3 countries and actively researching there. That's France, Belgium, and Canada. Because Lefever actually means Smith. And so to try and do it in those countries is going to be a challenge, and I'm going to be joining Paul with his numbers once I stray into those countries. Where I find records in those countries, I then make use of them and do the family's research. However, I don't go at this stage actively looking for them in those 3 countries. At the moment, there's 4,800 individuals across the 15 countries. As I say there, I've finished 3 countries. Well, the records that are currently available, but they are small numbers. Like if you look at Ireland, I've got 6 Lefevers in all time in Ireland, so that was relatively easy to knock off as a country. Hey, tomorrow there might be some more Irish records, and I might find a few more, but at the moment, they're finished. Where possible, I take images of all the records I find, and I attach those to the individuals, so that if anybody should ever want to pick up my study at any time in the future, at least they know where I've got the information from. Most of the variants are increasing in all countries, but as I mentioned earlier, Lefever, ER, seems to be dying out in the UK. The tools that I use, Family Historian is my genealogy program of choice. I make great use of some of the scripting facilities, the searching facilities of Family Historian. I've got a WordPress website which stores the data. An interesting discussion we're going to have a little bit later is how much data we put online. And Paul and I have totally differing view on that, and hopefully that will lead to some discussion amongst you when we come to that. JEDXL8 is a free program for conversion of JEDCOMs to CSVs, because the CSV file is what I actually put on my website. CSV Edit, which is a program I've written myself, which is an online tool that some people here have made use of, which takes that's wrong. Convert CSV to website CSV. Sorry, I've jumped on one. CSV Edit, that's a CSV editor. If you do anything in CSV, it's a free CSV editor, and I'd recommend having a look at it. XL to JED is the XL to JEDCOM converter that I touched on that some people here have used. HTML text extractor and Outwit Hub. Bob's going to talk about Outwit Hub tomorrow, which is methods of scraping data from websites. GenScriber and Transcript. Tessa mentioned Transcript. They're transcribing tools, again, both free. Pop an image up in one window and transcribe it in another window, either into CSV file or whatever. And then finally, Notepad++, which is Notepad on steroids for converting plain text documents. It's very powerful editing facilities. The other thing with it is there's a JEDCOM extension, so it actually displays a JEDCOM properly with all its tags. And so if you've got a JEDCOM that you just want to edit one small piece of data, it's an ideal tool for that. That's it from me, and I shall pass over to Paul.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Gosh, where to start? Well, why did I start my study? Well, my name is Howes. As I did my own family tree, I discovered that my father had 2 lines of ancestors named Howes, and also that my mother had 1. I also have a Smith problem. In Norfolk, Howes means Smith. So here's the size of it. Potentially, these are the numbers of people with my surname, including variants, in the 1880-ish studies, census records. Interestingly, the US is larger than the UK in 1881, a fact that I didn't know when I chose that surname to add into my study. In the UK, you find Howes, Howes and Howes, that is H-O-W-E-S, WSE and USE, are practically interchangeable in some parts of the country, in particular in Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. And consequently, you can't do one study without really straying into the others. So I added it in, and then found all these people in America. And it turns out that there's a perfectly good German name of Haus, H-A-U-S, and it's been anglicized, so I'm stuck with them as well. It started in early 2008, and went online in 2008 following some correspondence with Ken Toll. I'd written an article for the Norfolk Family History Society saying what I was going to do, but I was only going to do it for Norfolk. And there was some discussion between Ken and me offline, and I joined the guild, and well, here I am. But the first thing I realized about this was that these frequencies, even without all those American ones in there, was just too big for me to do on my own. So everything I do in the study is dictated by its size and the fact that I need other people's help. And consequently, I went online very quickly. I only had about 5,000 people in my online database when I first went online, but that was enough to start getting contacts from other people. Also, I've decided to focus on the area of time with the best records. In the 19th century, you've got census and all the rest of it, you all know that stuff. If I nail the 19th century, I can bring it forward in time and build it backwards in time, and do everything from a solid platform. You know, you can't build a building on shaky foundations. So if I get the 19th century nailed, everybody who's researching those names has to come through my site at one point. They'll find me. And that's the way we've been working for the last 5 or 6 years, and it seems to work. Because basically, in business terms, we're adding value by showing reconstructed family trees on the web. So people don't just come across data, they come across, oh, you've done part of my tree for me, this is great. You know, one correspondent said, wow, you've taken me back 7 generations in one visit to your website, it's terrific. And I would say, yes, everything's virtual. I have very few paper records. I started this originally from an apartment in Amsterdam, and I had no wish to carry vast amounts of paper with me. And so consequently, I think the only paper records I have practically are a bunch of 400 or 500 certificates. That's it. Next slide. I keep track. Being an actuary, I'm good, have some facility with numbers. I keep track of how many people are in my database, that is, in reconstructed families, every month, and just record them on a graph. You can see after I retired, the line started to separate, and gradually came back together again with having a job on the committee, and most recently with moving house, the productivity's fallen quite a lot. But you may ask me how I can get all this stuff done. Well, this is mostly my occupation, and I've given up TV. I don't watch TV. It reduces productivity by more than 50%. It's not worth it. The notes down at the bottom may be helpful, because I do keep track of some things. I have a master list on a spreadsheet of all the marriages in England and Wales between 1837 and 1950, which I think is still the most reliable sort of time span you can get on FreeBMD. And of those, I know both partners, and they're in reconstructed trees for 13,400 of those. And of those, I know the actual location for over 5,000. And I have to bow down and say thank you very much to all of those folks who do marriage challenges, because my study would have been pretty much impossible without those. Probably about a third of all those marriages have marriage details, the actual locations have come from marriage challenges. It's been a great help. Another slide here. So process publicity, which is pretty fundamental to my study at least. I use Family Historian. I used to use Family Tree Maker. My two helpers, who are both entering data, also use Family Tree Maker. I had to give it up because it was crashing my computer every time, because it's such a big file and you keep editing it. It doesn't matter how much you tend the database, it continued to crash my computer. So I switched to Family Historian. It's magic. The Family Historian files are native GEDCOM, and they are 1/7 of the size of the Family Tree Maker equivalent file. So I have no problems with computers crashing. I use TNG for my website. I use box.com, which is a bit like Dropbox. Use box.com as online storage, so all my backups. I have weekly backups for my website and weekly backups for my database. They all go online, and my fellow team members can access those and download the master file to their computers, which is additional backup facility and very helpful. We use box.com to manage all the images on our website. So we have about 1,700 images, mostly certificates, but all kinds of different things, places, pictures of houses where people lived. And they're all backed up online in the box. And use LibreOffice just because it's free and I'm cheap. If you didn't know, it's the free version of MS Office. So it has a spreadsheet and PowerPoint equivalent and a database and so on. I mentioned the team. There are 5 of us in 3 different countries. So my cousin Ian lives in Sutton in Surrey, and he's almost full-time data entry. We have another new volunteer, Mike Howard, who's in Hamptonshire, and he worked through various databases and constructing families away from marriages. And we have a gentleman in Spain who manages all the images on our site and formats them neatly so that they can go up on the website. And one lady in Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire who, she and her husband love solving puzzles. So after I met them, they came to Norfolk on a visit one day, they decided to work their way through the Commonwealth War Graves website. Because there are about 700 people named Howes who've given their life for king, queen, or country. And so what they do is they work through each one of those individuals and work back and reconstruct a family until they find somebody in my site they can connect it up with. And they send me the information and I dutifully enter it all up. It's a great time saver for me and good fun for them. I'd love to have all the people doing all the little websites and sort of linking back in the same way. I refresh all the data on my website every week. Interesting point for me at least is I have over 900 people who've registered on my site. About a third of those have gone on to share data with me and correspond with me. But that 900, I think, is an indication that I'm getting something right. You know, I get 3 or 4 new people a week now, and I don't do the work. Google does the work. People just search for their ancestor, and they find me. You know, the volume of data helps, of course, but Google does the work. I was even contacted recently by a BBC researcher who was researching somebody who'd married a house, and he said our database was by far the most helpful in doing the research on the person he was looking at. We produce a monthly newsletter sort of describing our progress on our website, and also, you know, really interesting items about house I picked up from a automated Google search that I have. People seem to find it interesting. About 200 people a month read that. 2 of my team members work completely logically. So, as I said, one works through marriages, another one works registration district by registration district, and just knocks off all of the people, house people born, died, married in that registration district, places them all in families. And but me, I can't do that because I've got so many customers to deal with. I really do think of this like a business. I go where the customers go. So if somebody writes in from Australia, I'll go to the Australian sources and aid the research and add more detail to it if I can. And yes, I get 5 to 10 emails a day from people other people researching my name. So I sort of regard this as a worldwide team effort. There are just 5 lead team members. For publicity, getting the name out, I have occasional speaking gigs, a bit like this one, and newspapers and articles that I've written. I've done a bit of blogging, and one little tip for you: if you want to publicize your study, on Ancestry at least, when you make corrections in there, your note stays on the file. So I always put www.housefamilies.com at the bottom. So anybody else coming along researching is likely to see my correction and therefore find my site. I've had 2 donations now. I had a first donation just before I put the slides together and had another one, so I'm paying a good proportion of this year's running cost, or being able to buy another 10 certificates with the donations I've had, which is really great. And just finally on publicity, we'll probably talk about this a bit more, but if you Google House One Name Study, we have all of the results on the first page and the top 2 on the second page as well. I didn't bother counting after that. So it is possible to, if you're careful and grab some land whenever it appears on the internet, you can further your profile of your study.
Fabulous. So what we did, you've now got some idea about the approaches these folks take. Perhaps you recognise parts of one's bigger, perhaps parts of another, recognised a tool here, a tool there. What we did was look through and use the Guild's 7 pillars as a framework to compare and contrast the approaches that these guys were taking to their studies, because based upon one of these pillars, they can pair up or separate differently. So, without any further ado, we're going to try and explore to some extent why folks have taken a particular approach to doing their one name study. What I'll have up here is a kind of background question that was used, thank you, that was used to frame the question. So, diving straight into data collection, I've kind of lumped data collection, analysis, and synthesis. If it's not obvious why, then please ask. But Tessa, you're up first again. Okay. Question 1. With your study being relatively recent, please can you tell us what you did or how you got started with your study? Where did you start and how did you start?
Okay, the way that it came about was we we know my grandfather's name and we knew his parents' names, but he had come to the United States. All of the rest of his family had stayed in Newfoundland, and although they interacted with letters, they didn't, see each other again. And so when I first asked my father, so who were his parents, who were his grandparents, my father just kind of gave me this clueless look, and he said, we didn't talk about that. And so trying to find which Keoughs were his was the process of going online and finding somebody who was actually related to us. And I was pretty lucky in that there is a Facebook page for the small community that he's from. And so it was one of the first times I ever saw the Keough surname used a lot, and I saw it in the 1945 and 35 census, and I thought, wow, there's a whole bunch of them, because it's still pretty unusual to find in the United States. So I started asking questions that way, and what I discovered early on was, and this would be my third great-grandfather, his name was Andrew. He had 7 sons and I think 6 daughters off the top of my head, and the names are all the same. Somebody's named Andrew, somebody's named James, Patrick, Michael, John, the standard Roman Catholic names. And as each of those sons had children, they each had an Andrew. So in this very small community, you had 6 Andrews. And I was trying to figure out how do these all come together. And that's how I ended up starting my one-name study. I went to the Grand Banks website, which is just a group of volunteers who transcribe everything they can find about Newfoundland records. And it's amazing, and very lucky to have found that. And then I went online and looked at Family Search, and it was to basically get an understanding. And then the next thing that I did was look at Wikipedia, because I knew nothing about Newfoundland. I had to find out the entire history. And in the way that I approach my one-name study is I find out about the place first. I want to know about the history and the records that are collected and the culture and all of that. And then I can get into finding the records, because otherwise I don't know what records they kept in another country. And I would say that's the biggest problem with crossing the pond and going to either Ireland or England. You all call things differently or name things differently than we do. And, trying to figure out how you get your records together or how they're all organized or whatever, you really do have to spend that time doing the research before you start just grabbing information. I think if you grab information at the outset, sooner or later you have to go back and do it over again. So I wanted to do it right the first time. And I would also say, I took the Pharaohs class before I even started gathering records, and that's probably backwards from what most people do. But to me, it was more helpful. I wanted to know how to do it first. I would also say, as a kind of quick aside, that the first experience I had with any one-namers was, Bob, you were doing a hangout, trying to hang out because it was new and different, I think from a pub at an AGM, and I happened to just see it and joined in, and that was the first time I met any other one-name studiers. And then I met Gary Barton, and Paul House was on occasionally, Colin was, and once you could put faces with names and find out information from other people, that really helped me figure out how to approach my study. So I would say, you're all in the room, so I'm preaching to the choir. It's been the best use of my money to join the Guild of One Name Studies, both for the information that's on the website as well as the people whose brains I've been picking for the last few years. So that's basically how I started my study, trying to find the information in Newfoundland, trying to figure out how we were related, and then going from there.
Perfect, thank you, Tessa. Colin, you mentioned you started off with name gathering, so you were trawling for names, but changed your approach.
I'd got a lot of my own Lefever family information, courtesy of my great aunt, right when I started my genealogical journeys over 30 years ago. She was an incredible lady. She could remember dates of birth of her great-grandparents, and they later proved to be correct. I didn't find one piece of information she gave me that was wrong. So I got a whole lineage done in one go. But there are a lot of Lefevers in and around the East End of London, the Bethnal Green area. And so I started gathering all of those to see if there were any more of mine that she didn't know about. And then that led to gathering a load in Canterbury, just down the road. There's another little pocket of them there. And I found I was just gathering names and no stories, no information with them, no families. And that wasn't what I was used to doing. I was used to doing my own genealogy, and I wanted to see how people related to one another, how their roles and jobs changed throughout the years, how they moved. And I realized that it's great having 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 names in a database, but that's all it is, they're names. And for me, it then became apparent that I wanted more from the research I was doing. And so that was why I just stopped using Outwit Hub and some of the data scrapers just to scrape hundreds of records. I've still got those hundreds of records parked, but I'm not using them at this moment in time. I'm, as I said earlier, concentrating on doing it in families, because I think that, for me, is where my interest lies, is understanding the names, how the names change over the year, the jobs, locations. And I've got individuals, like I found one getting married in Portsmouth, but place of birth was Barbados. So I spoke to the expert on Barbados, who then told me how to go ahead and do some Barbados research. So I then found the birth in Barbados of that individual, and that all came about from one marriage record. So suddenly I've jumped to another country and found a little pocket of Lefevers, and it turned out the father was born in Portsmouth, but he was customs and excise for her or His Majesty at the time, gathering money in Barbados, and that's where this woman was born. And so that's why I do it, for the information about the families and the stories that go with them.
So to characterise the differences, and without this necessarily being a popularity contest, Tessa and myself, I characterise it as being taking a horizontal slice through a record set, so maybe births in the UK, for example, or a census in the US, and we'll go after all of them. Whereas these fellas have started off with trees. I was always going to leave the trees till last. There's some pros and cons to that approach. It certainly makes data collection pretty dull. So that's how we intend to carry this on. Very, very different approaches. Whether you go horizontally through slices, important slices, how you prioritize which slices are important, obviously up to you, or whether you start off with the truth. Ready? On to the next. Do you belong? Is there anything you wanted to add, Paul? It'll keep. Yeah, we've got plenty of time. Do you belong? And Paul, this is for you. Do you belong to any groups or societies that help you with your study? If so, who and why?
Well, yes, I belong to the Guild. I'm also a member of the Norfolk Family History Society, and for family reasons, a Cardiganshire one. But generally speaking, no, I don't find groups or societies that much help in what I'm doing. The main source, the main things I belong to are paid sources of data. So, you know, the two big obvious ones in the UK. And the Norfolk Family History Society also has a bunch of data online, as the Society of Genealogists do, but I generally use them as resources when I run out of ideas on how to find things elsewhere. So not much of an answer for you on that one.
For me, likewise, the Guild, the two big providers, plus the freebie Family Search, and that is, and of course, FreeBMD. That for me, again, I don't find conventional genealogical societies offer much for one-namers unless you have got a large pocket in some county and they've got a lot of records that are relevant. That's
perhaps I could add that the Norfolk Family History Society is a great source of information on other people studying my name for exactly that reason.
Yeah. But for me, that's that I used to belong to the Spencer Society in the States when I was doing my genealogy, Hampshire, Dorset, because that's where my personal genealogy comes from. But when it comes to a one-name study, personally, I've not found a lot of value.
So, these two folks have joined family history societies for perhaps local knowledge, data sourcing. Tessa,
I'm
how
going to
have you
disagree.
found the experience of...
I'm going to disagree with them. I understand where they're coming from. In the United States, and this, I think this is the case in some other places as well. You know, I belong to the Guild, of course, but I belong to the Genealogical and Historical Societies in Newfoundland. I also joined one in Washington because that's where our family ended up. And I belong to some other local societies where I've done research. Minnesota has some great, it has a really great umbrella historical group and genealogical group. And one of the reasons is because there is a tremendous amount of data, at least in the United States, at historical and genealogical societies that is not transcribed or online. And so you can actually find collections, cemetery records, that kind of stuff that you're looking for. And that's one reason that I belong to them. And then also to understand more about the records in those various places. The second reason I belong to various local historical societies or genealogical societies is because I feel that you have to kind of pay it forward a little bit. They were there when I first started doing genealogy. They have educational programs. They do transcription work. And I think it's really important to have a membership in them because as people don't renew their memberships in the local groups, I think they're going to die away. And, you know, I'm sure some people would say that's okay, you know, we're not getting a lot of value. But in many instances, and in the groups that I belong to, I've gotten a lot out of it just by being able to ask individuals questions or find out, you know, answers to general questions that I think that's worthwhile. And I want that organization to be there for someone else in the future when they get started.
Fair comment. Okay, good. What else do we have? I think we've done this one. Still on data collection, analysis, and synthesis. Oh, you've read it? Okay. You haven't seen this, have you? So then we come into some of the meat and to veg of this stuff. How will you ever know that you're done either collecting data, analysing it, or with family reconstructions? And if you can never know you're done, how do you balance the needs of other pillars? Got another good question coming next. So which one of you guys would like to tackle this first?
I'll have a go at this because this question, we asked ourselves this question because of something Gordon had said some years ago at a Guild conference. How will you know when you're done, lad? And I think it's a very fair question. You know, you can go ploughing on doing family reconstructions, but how do you know when you've finished? And I guess at one level the answer is no, but at the other level you need to have collected the data from the underlying data sets to go back and cross them all off. And so within my study at least, we note where we've had some information from the national registration in the England and Wales. So if somebody's from Wyndham, for example, in Norfolk, we note the registration data and call it 4HO RD in Norfolk, and that goes in our database, so that we can run a report on all the events that happened in 4HO RD, and then cross them all off the list of the data set when we think we're being close to finished, and then all we have to do is find the few remaining ones. Essentially, it's the same approach I'm doing while I'm working with marriages, but I have trouble with detail, and I think if I had all the data sets done and then started reconstructing family histories, I'd spend so much of my time crossing the things off the list that I'd actually be more inefficient working that way. So I keep my master marriage list, and at some point in the back of my mind is the need to go back and use those basic data sets as checklists.
For me, as I said, I've got 3 countries that are done because there are so few, and I've trawled through all the online records that are currently available. But tomorrow there'll be some more, and it's actually keeping track of how you go back and look for more to see if there are some new records for an area that are suddenly online. And that's one of the challenges we've got going forward. For instance, last week, Family Search added another 5 million records. And they do this regularly. How often do you go and check to see if some new ones have appeared in there? But another little anomaly that I've found is you look at the census figures on Ancestry. There are, according to Ancestry, if you do the broad search, 4 Lefevers in Oxfordshire in 1841. I've already found 8 living in Oxfordshire in 1841. So don't always believe the search tools, and I'm sure that our data providers are going to get that in their neck a little later. But I think that's the other thing is actually looking at your search terms to make sure you are searching with a broad enough brush to make sure that you have got everybody that is available.
And Tessa, I don't know if you've got anything to add here, but I was just thinking what I'll say is that I took an approach of actually starting. Sorry? Oh, is there a lockback? How's that? Is that better? Sorry. My approach on this was really not knowing how to balance the needs of, say, data analysis versus synthesis versus collection versus family reconstructions per se. But because my surname is place name based, I actually started with the analysis, look at the origins, distributions of the surname. That helped me decide which places I should be interested in from a data collection point of view. So my surname's from Cheshire. I knew that as soon as the Cheshire parish records came online, I would have to spend a good amount of time extracting those Cheshire records as what I would call a one-name study priority interrupts. Same thing with Barbados. I knew it's popular in Barbados, so I would have to spend time going through those. Between those 2 areas, say Cheshire, Barbados, everything else is much less important. So weighing up the pros and cons of a certain approach is important. Is there anything you want to add here, Tessa?
The one thing that I would say is by doing a combination, I don't know that there's anyone, and maybe you can get a show of hands at some point, is there anyone who does strictly data collection, versus anyone who does strictly family reconstructions? At some point you're gathering data, and at some point you're reconstructing a family because you don't want duplicates in your file. And so I do think we kind of straddle that area a little bit. For my purposes, collecting that data, I took it, exactly 180 degrees, different from what Paul did, but we come to the same place. And it might be the way that somebody works, what they think is logical. We all have different ways of learning or what have you. And so for me, having all of that data, knowing that I've gone through the 1945 census, for instance, and have all of those instances and can check that off my list because there are no more census pages. I've seen the original census pages for Newfoundland. Then I can reconstruct a family. And I do think the one thing that's a little difficult, and I'd be interested in knowing what members of the audience say, is how do you keep track of the research you've done, or when you need to go back and check something like Ancestry or Family Search, when records are going to show up again? I keep project files by country so that I know to go back, every year and look. And if they've added 5 names, I'm not going to worry about it. If they add 200 names, I'll go back and run another data collection and then, compare the 2 and look for duplicates. That's how I approach it.
Yeah, and
I don't think we're ever done. Isn't that the case? You drop dead?
So I won't feel bad about being caught in the pub then. I think we're coming to that question in a couple of slides. So thank you, Colin. Let's crack on to the next one. We've heard about two fundamentally different approaches, if you like. One to what I would call a source or data-led approach in terms of harvesting stuff and putting it in one treasure trove. Let's not worry about the name or the brand of that treasure trove. But some folks take a family tree-led approach here. So what do you do with things like a probate record, for example? Do you put it into some kind of source repository, be it an Excel card index file, custodian clues, or something of that ilk? Or do you not bother with that stuff and put the data straight into a family tree? I think when I started, I was of the opinion that a family tree was a place for analysed facts, and I would only put people into a family tree if I could connect them together. But it's actually that connecting together that's the fun part. Collecting all the data pieces is actually pretty dreary. It's the actually analysing it and putting folks together that's much more interesting. But you have to do something with the source records. So what do you do here? Again, Paul versus Colin. What do you guys do? How do you handle sources?
I use Family Historian, as I commented on in my slides earlier, and I use Ancestral Sources, which is a plugin that works in conjunction with, which will work with any GEDCOM file, and it is for adding sources to a GEDCOM file. The advantage of using something like Ancestral Sources, you create one source, be it a census record, birth, baptism, death, burial, and it allocates it to that one source to everybody in your tree that is referred to in that record that you found, and it attaches one image to all of those individuals from that source. That's how I approach the source side of things, but to the deduplication that can lead to, because if you just find a probate, for instance, as Bob used the probate example, you've got the benefit, you've got the grant of the probate, the person who died, you've got the spouse if they're mentioned, and you've got the person who actually probated the will, and sometimes beneficiaries mentioned, depending. My first task is looking at each of those names and seeing if I've got them that fit with the data there. If not, I then put it in as a new record and then go off and look for the marriage or other census record or what else that deals with that individual, and then reconstruct that tree. That's how I do it. And Family Historian has got some excellent tools in terms of find duplicates, so you can actually score duplicates. You can put your own weighting in there on surnames, first names, family names, locations, and it brings up a guidance as to what you think is, or what it thinks are potential duplicates. And you can then look at the individual records and make an educated guess. Paul, your turn.
Okay. That's interesting. We're not quite as similar as you think, which you'd expect, really. For sources, I have a very simplistic view of sources these days. When I did my own family history, I recorded all the reference numbers dutifully, and even then, when I was able to, then downloaded the images from Ancestry. But doing a one-name study, it's just impossible to download that much. And why would you use it anyway? And these days, when people have ready access to Ancestry through local libraries, at least in the UK, why bother? If I've recorded all the details for that person, I just write down the source of 1851 census, and the person there, I have the name. I record every occurrence of a name separately. So if you're W. Howes in one census and then William Spencer Howes in another one, you've got two different name records for that one individual. So I simply record 1841 or 1851 census, and somebody can go look it up if they want. Check my work that way. No problem. It's dead easy to use the search facilities in Ancestry to find that stuff. I think that the reason for the original long sources used is so that somebody else can go to a piece of microfilm and look it up. And that's way more difficult. And to do that, you actually need it. But these days, I don't think so. So I keep my sources very simple. It also cuts down on the size of the file. Things like probate, I'll only go to a probate record if at the end of reconstructing a family. And I'll use it sometimes to confirm the individual, because I've got something close to 2,000 people named William Howes in my database. So if I found a death of a William Howes, and I think it's the right one, often I'll be able to get confirmation from the probate. I'll find the actual date of death that will confirm the quarter, or maybe the spouse, or something like that. So I don't go to probate until I've done the rest of the family, because I refuse to put anything in the database unless I can associate it with somebody who's in a family. If I can't, I just ignore it and move on. That's just the way I work. And it's all to do with the basic principle of wanting to add value and put people in families for the benefit of other researchers and the benefit of Google when they come searching.
Okay, so these two guys source records directly into some kind of...
Sorry, but one other thing, duplication. I think the only time we can actually duplicate is assigning the same birth or death to another person, because I don't use checklists. We've got no means of avoiding it, except to run the reports every now and then and look for duplicates. For other situations, one of the real benefits of using family history software is the auto-complete feature. So occasionally I'll be entering an address and find the thing auto-completing that address as if I've already got it in the file. So then I go and run a report to see who else is at that address. Very, very occasionally, it's the same person. I'm just entering twice. More often, it's somebody from the same family that lived in that same address at a different point in time.
And Tessa, what's your approach to tackling sources here? For example, in your case, in your study, say a US Census, for example. How would you tackle it?
The first thing that I do is I go in and get all of the census information for the particular year. Say it's 1850, and I have an Excel spreadsheet that has the censuses, from 1810, I think is when we first have people here, up through 1940, and each of those is on a sheet. So it's a horizontal grab in that I've gotten the, basic information that's been indexed from, say, Ancestry.com or Family Search or whatever, large website I'm using. So I have that information together. I have a column on my Excel spreadsheet for when I connect them with a family, where their legacy record identification number would go or their marriage record identification number. So all of my US censuses are together, and that's filed in one workbook. All of my Scotland censuses, all of my Newfoundland ones, Canadian ones, whatever I'm working on. But I do grab that horizontal information. You can easily tell by looking at the, when you go to the website, who are the family members with them, and you can tell by the numbers they've been given or, where they show up. And so I make that notation, but until I can actually really put it together that is the relationship, because sometimes the relationships, at least in the U.S. Census, are incorrect. They might refer to somebody as a servant and it's a sister, or that kind of thing. And so you don't want to just believe everything you hear or read. So if I have the census information, I usually then focus by states, and I can take a look at, the birth information or the death information or find a grave or whatever. And that's when I start putting together that family, but I've grabbed all that information first. In the United States, and I don't know because I haven't spent much time with the British records, we get a lot of information. We get occupation, wages, where their parents were born, where they were born, if they speak English, the extent of their education, certainly in the 1940 census, where they lived 5 years before. On a couple of the censuses, you know how many children the woman had and how many are living as of the date of that census. So finding the information that way is really useful to me in order to look for those missing children or do some of that type of research, following them through their occupations. The Excel spreadsheet is useful because I can see how many Keoughs, maybe they were all farmers, or maybe they were, all, pick the occupation, pick where they were born. If you take the information that way, it just works for me as far as analyzing it much better than if I were to try and play around with a genealogy database. And I think it's only because I haven't gotten as far in my study as some of the others, perhaps, and played around with it as much. I also have a smaller number of people. I think if I had the house study, first of all, I'd be overwhelmed. But secondly, I do think you have to approach a study differently based on knowing what you have in front of you, how many records you might be collecting or how many families you might be trying to put together. And from my purposes, it worked really well to work country by country. Start with a region, expand it to the country, move on. I don't think I could jump around as much. That just wouldn't work for me, the way my brain works, or doesn't.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Tessa. One of the things I do feel important to point out at this stage is that I think we all agree that any kind of duplication that has you going back to something you've already done is a waste. Sometimes you have to revisit sources to check for somebody else. But if you've grabbed something and got it once, if you need to go back for it again, then that's a waste of your time. You can use duplication to your effort. To your own advantage, sorry. So in my own case, I was not able to eliminate duplications. So in the case of the UK births, marriages and deaths, I extracted the births, marriages and deaths from the books. Eventually able to grab the same source again from Free BMD, and then ultimately again from Find My Past. Find My Past just had more recent coverage as well as the older. So I had 3, and in some cases a 4th source of a birth, particularly with, let's say, local registration. So what's the point of having 4 sets of birth records for the same individual? Well, in that case, there's obviously none, because all the spellings are the same. But it's surprising when you've got different transcriptions how you can use one different transcription to your advantage. But duplication, I think, irrespective of the approach, is inevitable. So, what is your approach to letting people know that you are there, publicizing your study? Paul.
All right, Bob.
Mr. Google.
Yeah, I was going to say the answer is Google. And let Google do the work. At least it is now. Now that I've got so much data in there, if you search for anybody named House, you're going to find my site on page 1. If you go through the book and you look at the notes on publicity in here, it'll have things like placing adverts in magazines. Don't think that's nearly as effective as Google, but it's certainly worth writing the odd magazine article, or, whether it's for one of the big ones, the big national ones, or for your local family history society, particularly in the areas where your family is or where your study name is concentrated, and that will really help, because you're almost certainly going to get replies from other people who've got your name in their tree. What else can you do? The guild profile, I haven't looked recently to see what the counter is at the bottom of the page, but it does click on gradually, so people are visiting that page and hopefully then linking to my site. Google Analytics is worth having, and if you have a website, you can easily place a little thing called Google Analytics in there, and it tells you where your visitors are coming from, how long they stay on your site, how many pages they look at, and so on. So that's quite useful. Just to give you a sense, I get 100 unique visitors to my site every day. When I put in lots of publicity work, like, for example, when I was speaking at Who Do You Think You Are 2 or 3 years ago, that number went over 200 for per day for the month before my talk. So clearly, if you can get yourself on the speakers list for a big conference, people will research your name and go and look at your stuff. Other websites, you know, there are lots of them, places where you can go and put your URL. There's a new website out there called Genealogy Talk. If you haven't looked at that before, go make your own land grab on there for your own one-name study before somebody else comes along and ruins it. You know, both Ancestry and Family Tree DNA, you have links to your site from those places. The more links you've got spread over the web, the more likely you are to get the top 12 rankings, as I said before, on Google search. Social networking is kind of interesting. I don't do Twitter. I don't think in 140 characters, but I do a lot. I do go on Facebook a lot, and it's kind of interesting. I think here again, size has an impact. So if Bob gets a message on Facebook from somebody else named Cumberbatch, it probably makes his day. But if I send a message to somebody else named Howes, it's, oh, somebody else with the same surname as me. You know, big deal. There is much more fellow feeling among people with relatively unusual names than there is with somebody with name frequency of mine. So for me it doesn't work, although occasionally I'll pick off somebody. I made friends with a guy called Agustin Howes who lives in Buenos Aires. And his family's from Norfolk originally, but they didn't have an S in their name until the last 70 years or so. I don't know, don't ask me why they added an S. Most people tended to lose the S in the 19th century because they wanted to be associated with Admiral Howe or General Howe, who fought the Americans. Sorry, Tessa, nothing to do with me. So social networking has its place, I acknowledge, but not for a study the size of mine.
Following on from what Paul's just said, yeah, my own website, which I promote, I belong to several different forums, and my signature on there has the URL to my website. Like Paul, much smaller study, but if you put Lefever one name study, Lefever genealogy into Google, every single entry on the first page of that search will be a link to a page on my website. So you can do it yourself, and you can get yourself out there, literally just by getting your name in front of people. The other thing is Google does have a very good tool called Google Notifications. It's free, you can sign up to it, and I've got notifications every day from Google about new pages that appear with Lefever and genealogy on them. And it sends me an email with a link to each one of those new pages that Google has indexed that day. And so I go off and have a quick, some of them are from a Rebecca Lefever, who is a journalist in the States, and she writes about 8 articles a day in a newspaper. So I never look at any of hers, but if there's anything else interesting, I go off and have a look and see if there's something there for me. It's just getting your name in front of people, and there's lots of different ways of doing it. Twitter, whenever I put a new blog post up, it sends it to Twitter, sends it to Facebook, Google+. It's just getting it out there. How much use it is, for me, not a lot. I get 1 or 2 contacts a month, probably. Paul, I'm glad I don't have his number of contacts per day. I wouldn't even want his number of contacts per month for one of his days. So it's what you can cope with and how much effort you're prepared to put into it. Just getting your name out there.
Contacts per day. What does he mean? Perfectly lined up. Thank you, Colin. Paul, how do you handle queries that you receive?
Well, for most of my working life, I was in the consulting business, and I'd consult in all kinds of different things. It really depended on where the client wanted to go, and you know, I've been very fortunate in ending up with a hobby which is very much the same. So I'm a great believer in customer service and in customizing you know, according to what the customer needs. So everybody who registers on my site gets a long email from me explaining the site, asking for feedback, asking for help, asking for them to tell me, if they haven't already told me when they registered, who's your, are you connected with somebody in the database? That email is pretty constant. I vary it a little bit, but most of it's pre-written. And how much I customize it depends upon how much I can see about that person. If they already tell me their name is Howard, then I can eliminate the other ones from the list. But if they haven't told me, I have to write all 6 of them out. So that's all pre-written. It's easy enough to do. Other than that, pretty much everybody gets a reply from me within 24 hours.
How many emails a day?
Around, I'd say an average of 5. Sometimes it's as many as 10. Sometimes as little as 3.
And you build a database of...
Oh, well, one key thing. This is common, I think, from my very first Guild conference I went to in Cheltenham. And Polly Rubery was talking about DNA, and she talked about how important it was to keep a list of your contacts. And she's absolutely right. My list of contacts is pretty simple. It's a name, their email address, if I know where they actually live, and the name of their oldest house ancestor, approximate date, if I know it, when that person was born, and the location. So that if somebody else registers on my site with a similarly, or with an ancestor with those same details, I'll offer to put the 2 researchers together, only if they register on my site. And this is just a little tip. That's why going to Guild conferences is so great, because you pick up little tips like that.
And this happened to me only a week ago. After this very last preparation session, I had a contact from someone, mentioned some names. Of course, I looked them up. I'm already recognizing the names. And she turns out to be a relative of another line that moved to England. So from Barbados, now in the US, to a relative in the UK. They suspected there were relatives in each country, but had no way of finding out. Had I not been able to join the dots, they would never have known. It would just be an email that I would have responded to, and they wouldn't have got the benefit. Right, I think we're done with this one. Unless you want to add something, Colin, sorry. Tessa, do you want to add something?
No, I'll just say that I learned so much even from the prep session, that I thought, I'm going to have to start keeping this list. I haven't gotten a lot of, questions or anything yet, but it's always better to have the format set up, so that you can just plug it in. And I think that that's something that was really helpful to hear about, how both Colin and Bob put together, pushing themselves out there online as well as responding to questions that they get.
For me, responding to queries, I get very few. I always give people as much information as I can when they do contact me. I had a contact from Canada about 6 months ago, and I sent him a whole stack of stuff because it just happened that he was inquiring about one of the Canadian lines that I got information on. And I never heard a word back from him, so I was a little peed off, to put it mildly. However, last week he sent me an email and said, I've got this Lefever book, would you like, or this book about people who lived in Quebec in 1700s, and there's a section on Lefever. Have you seen it? No. Would you like a copy? Yes, please. So he promptly sent me through 10 pages of Lefever records that I hadn't got in Canada, in Quebec in Canada. Great. But they were all spelt Lefevre. So I went back to him and said, why are they all spelt this way? Why are there no variants? He said, you've got to bear in mind, he said, in the 1700s, most of Canada was illiterate. He said, the person that prepared this book spelt all the names the way he spelt it. And that's it. So trying to put those people into families is going to be challenging, because when they could read and write, perhaps a little later, they probably had the different variant spellings. So don't automatically dismiss people who don't respond back to you after you've given them information. Sometimes they come up trumps.
One thing we discovered were different thoughts about how much data you should publish that might generate for you queries. Clearly, at one end of the spectrum, if you don't publicize the fact that you're running a study and don't publish any data, then it can be reasonably sure that you will not get any contact. At the other end of the spectrum, if you publish all of your data, all of your trees, all your research stories, call it what you will, does that also mean that you will get no contact because everything's out there? So what's the relationship between publishing data and contacts? Paul, in your experience here, is less more?
First of all, yes. More is more. So I publish everything I have online. Everything's in the shop window. Of the 84,500 people in reconstructed families on my website, you can see the full details for 69,000 plus of them. The only reason you can't see the 15,000 difference is that those people were born within the last 100 years, and I don't know that they've died. I'm just respectful. You know, around the world we all have different privacy standards. All my correspondents from South Africa say they don't care. Many Americans say we want to see everything online, but I know that the Brits and the Australians are a lot more cautious, and so you have to set the standard somewhere. But for me, by publishing so much, shows people the level and the depth of research that I've done, and places me firmly as the authority on my name around the world. And that's what we're all about in the Guild. So if I don't doubt that there are some mistakes in there, but I always encourage people to write in and tell me if they've got any additions or corrections. It does happen, and I'm pleased that they do. So I'm pleased all the time. We're homing in on being 100% accurate, but we won't ever get there. I know that. There'll always be some mistakes in there. But my database is way more accurate than almost all of the trees on Ancestry.com. And, you know...
Whereas for me, I take the opposite approach to Paul. I regard my website as being more of a bait to hook people and get them in. I put BMD and spouse. That is all I put on. I don't put I don't put their children and how they relate. Their children are on there as individuals, but not linked into the family. So I don't actually display the family information, I just display the individual information and spouse if it's there, hoping that people will contact me. Maybe that's why I only get 2 or 3 a month and Paul gets 10 a day. I don't know, but that's the way I do it because I want the contact. Maybe I've got the smaller name, that's why I get the smaller number of contacts. Something that this discussion and this prep for this discussion has caused has maybe made me to start to think about maybe I should adopt more of Paul's approach. And I'm thinking about doing that for one country, I haven't decided which yet, to actually put the full data, the same way that Paul does, online in reconstructed trees and see if that gets me more contact as a result. And it'll be interesting to see and leave the rest as I do now with just the BMD information.
Okay, and the last, and certainly not the least of the pillars, is preservation. Tessa, what have you learned in terms of lessons that have driven you to take the approach you take to preserving your study?
All right, the first thing I did when I joined the Guild was, and started attending the Hangouts, was I used the mentoring system, which surprisingly enough, not many people have heard about. And then I also asked everyone who was in the Hangouts, if you were starting today, what would you do differently? Or what did you do that you're really happy you did it this way, type of thing. And so I learned a lot of lessons from people right from the get-go. So I was able to learn that lesson by hearing about it rather than by experiencing it. And I think the first lesson I learned was that at some point everyone has lost some of their work, whether that's a hard drive crash, they had something on a jump drive and they misplaced it, or maybe they saved their information a certain way and then they weren't able to read it later, either because they no longer had a the right disk drive or whatever. And then people who backed up their work told me that they had never checked to make sure of what they were backing up or if it actually worked. And so then when they tried to restore their work, thinking, oh, I've saved my work, they didn't have anything. So the lesson I learned was kind of twofold. First of all, back up my work regularly. I kind of have taken the approach that if I don't want to do it over again, spend those few moments backing it up, and then you won't have to do it over again. I think you only have to go right back in and do something again to know that you don't want to do that. The other thing was when I was learning about backing up information and how to restore it, I went through that exercise to make sure that I was correctly backing up and correctly, that I could restore it and get it back out of the backup system. I think that's really important to do. I think it's important to have more than one backup. I know people are syncing their work to the cloud, or to other computers. You need to back up your work, and then you also should be archiving it at a certain point, and I do that on a yearly basis as well, so that, it's somewhere. It's also not at my home, it's at my sister's home, and I know she'll never touch it because she's not interested at all in it. But, having that type of check on yourself, I think, is really important. So having that offsite storage, knowing how to restore your work. And then the other thing that's pretty important is whether you use free software or shareware or programs that you pay for, you do need to make sure that instead of jumping around a lot, you learn that program and learn everything it can do for you, and then keep that program up to date, because that's another way you can lose information, is to, not update the program and not be able to read it later or something. And I know people who've run into that. So I would say learn the programs and the apps and whatever else you're going to work with, and really make sure that you understand your programs and what you've done with your information. And just always know that this lesson was from Thomas McKenty. He said, it's not if your hard drive is going to crash, but when. And luckily, that hasn't happened to me yet, but if it did, it wouldn't be a problem for me because of the way that I back up.
Thank you, Tessa. Some wise advice. I think up until now, I certainly was considering preservation as what happens to my study when I'm no longer here. But no, you raised...
I have years, I'm hoping.
Fabulous. But I think I have certainly fallen into the trap of what happens when I die, rather than making sure that all the stuff you do day to day is saved. I'm conscious that so far up until now we've kind of talked at you. You've got some idea of what the folks do, their approach, some ideas about the 7 pillars. Do you guys have any questions you'd like to interrogate these guys with? Thank you, Doug. There's a pint in it.
Both Paul and Colin spoke of the 2 big ones as far as data sources go. I mean, when I think of data sources, I'm thinking of 6 big ones, so I'm wondering what the 2 big ones are.
For me, I regard Find My Past and Ancestry as the big ones, as the paid, and of course Family Search as the free one. That's what I regard as the big ones.
Yeah, exactly the same. But I use lots of other resources. If I'm looking in Australia, obviously you have to go to Trove. There's no way of avoiding it. It's absolutely a brilliant resource, and it's completely free. Australian National Archives as well have got military service records on there, and they're even better than what you'll find on the 2 paid sources in the UK.
Tessa, is there anything you want to add by way of big ones?
I agree with the 3 that were mentioned, and then I really believe you have to go to your country, as Paul was mentioning. Canada has excellent records. Look up the country, and you will find, and I'll give a plug to the Guild wiki at this point. They list a lot of you know, when you're searching by country, things to always be checking out. And I think that that's important in addition to the 3 large companies that do it.
Any more questions? Kim, is that a yes? Or was that a stretch? No.
I think we've talked a lot about data collection and reconstitution today, and I know, Tessa, you mentioned doing some organizing of your data to help analysis, and Bob, I think you mentioned distribution, but I would like to hear from each of you more about, have you thought about other types of analysis? Are you doing other types of analysis on your data, and what steps you're doing to help do that analysis?
From an analysis perspective, I went into this, my one name study, looking at some of the sources we heard mentioned this morning in the talks, and some of the other published works about the origins of the Lefever name, and where it was distributed in the UK. And 3 years on, about 70% of that was accurate, but there's about 30% that wasn't. In terms of distribution, once you actually start digging down into the data that is currently available, and that analysis I do, Kim, to answer your question, is by using the query tools that are built into Family Historian. I keep on about it, but it's the program I use, and it's how I do my data analysis. It's got a query language built in, so you can construct your own queries and say, right, show me all the people born between these dates in this county, or this village, or in this area. Surname mapping is something that I've got interested in from following some of the conversations on Facebook. It's something I've not done anything with yet, but it's something I think going forward is going to become more important to actually understand some of the analysis that you're talking about, Kim.
Yeah, I'm smiling while Colin's talking, because last year when I was at Roots Tech, that's what, 15 months ago, I spent $40 on this really super looking mapping tool, and I haven't taken it out of the box. I've been too busy. But I did a little bit of mapping early on, which is how I figured out I needed to have HOUSE as part of my study, because if you map out the 3 main surname variations in the UK, they fit together like a jigsaw. It's quite amazing. And so for me, that's what, as I said, it drove me to include that extra surname in my study. But that's practically all the mapping I've done so far. Really, as regards analysis, my long-term quest, where I started out in my study, is to find the origin of my name. And 5 years on, I'm a little bit closer to that. And I keep a log of all the occurrences of my name before parish records began. A little bit like some of the examples that the speaker was talking about this morning. And I've found all kinds of odd things, even a court leap records from the Manor of South Reps in Norfolk, where a Margaret Atta Howe, otherwise Howes, was fined for letting her dog worry sheep in 1479. So I find all this stuff, and gradually it will form a picture. But I don't kid myself I'm going to get there anytime soon, because I have to be sure that I'm building back my family trees on solid foundations of the 19th century. Then I'll go back in greater depth. Today I have one tree that goes back to a gentleman who died in 1457. But that's as far as I've gone. I've no doubt I'll find others as time goes on.
Tessa, is there something you want to add to this?
Sure. I will say that because I started in Newfoundland and then went on to Canada and parts of the United States, obviously what's most important is, or the thing that shows up right away, is migration. They left from somewhere to get to Newfoundland and the United States. So the migration has been interesting, and you're able to find that information in the immigration records that the United States has. Two other things that I've looked at in detail, and it was because of the record sets that I got at the outset. I was able to get death records and burial records, and so one of the things was what was the cause of death? What were these people dying of, over the years in Newfoundland and in the United States? And that's been really interesting. And I was also able to make real use out of it in that my nephew, who's in medical school, they used it as a case study. But then the other thing that I've looked at a lot is military service and occupation, because a lot of times that also enters into why they left one country and went somewhere else. And I think because I'm on this side of the pond, I have that information to look at, and maybe there's less of it, or maybe people are moving around in the UK. But for instance, I wasn't able to find any immigration information in Newfoundland, and I was kind of surprised until I discovered that they were all British subjects. So you have to learn some history, I guess, at the beginning, and that's why it's helpful. But I would say the migration with mapping for that, military service, occupations, and then cause of death has been something that I've been analyzing because of the record sets I got, as opposed to family reconstructions.
And in my own case, Kim, I talked about how I got started, did some analysis to work out, and I was lucky, my surname's named after a place, so I could work out the importance of collecting data from those sources. However, there is what I would call analysis you can do before you get started or as you're going, but then there's analysis you can do at the end. And I can't say I'm finished, but one thread that I'm particularly interested in is something that Dick alluded to this morning. My brother and sisters are twins. And do twins run in families? Can you trace it back through generations of folks? Are certain branches more susceptible, let's say, to having twins? That's been an interesting slice through the records. It's not always obvious to find them, but I think it's worth keeping tabs on in my own case. Any other thoughts?
I was struck until Paul's comments just now that mostly you've talked about records after 1800. And you haven't been talking about data collection or analysis of the different types of records that come before we have censuses in either side of the Atlantic.
Approach it any different?
In some respects, the earlier records make family reconstruction easier because of the lack of migration of individuals, particularly when you come down to the ag labs and people of that status. That's my experience so far. And so once a church records become available online, you can trace a generation or more through relatively easily. That's how I have been doing it. You get to 1841, and with my family reconstruction, I then want to go back and see, right, what's the parish records for that parish? Were they there 10, 20, 30 years earlier? And then trace it back through the parish records that way. I haven't yet gone to the adjoining parishes to see if they've moved across the border, but again, I'm not that far into my study. But that's the approach that I take once censuses and national registration, or prior to them existing.
Yeah, I think my approach is pretty much the same. I'll take an individual family back as far as I can, easily using the sources available to me. But living 4,500 miles away from where most of the people hailed from originally, I have to work from online stuff. And if I find it and it's obvious, I'll use it. Just occasionally I'll come back here, and like 2 weeks ago, before I came back, a correspondent of mine in Canada told me that there was a really, really good family tree of houses that had been done by a single vicar who retired in London, had plenty of time on his hands in the 1880s, and he's the one that traced his family back all that far. So I've been in the record office, And while I'm there, I'm using my online sources to check what this man was telling me, and he's absolutely right. It was thoroughly well researched, and the last parts of his stuff were done by Wills. And at some point, I will reproduce that man's research, but having got it in front of me, I'll put it online. My secondary, and I'll quote the fact that I used a secondary source so that other people can see. They can go and check that secondary source if they want, or they can use that as the basis to reproduce the research themselves. I don't know how well it answered your question, Andrew, but I tried.
In my own case, Andrew, I know because my surname originates in a town in Cheshire. Any type of record I can get spreading out from Congleton, let's say, is important. I met for the first time Anne Cole, who's done a lot of work with the Paul Orr records. That's going to be what I would call an extremely rich source for my one-name study, more so than anything more recent, if that makes sense. Other than, you need to have all the other stuff to put the more recent trees together, but in adding colour to family records, then those sources are going to be much more important than, say, Birmingham or even London in my own case. But they just won't exist for Barbados. We did need to have some kind of common framework from a record source point of view. We did choose, perhaps wrongly, as we discovered, the 1880 census because Tessa can't count in the Irish her study using that, so it wasn't perfect. And maybe I've steered the group towards more recent records. So apologies, that wasn't making sense. Sorry.
One thing I'll mention is that, we do so much of the work online, but I will also say that having spent almost a month in Newfoundland, I went to the archives at the university, at Memorial University, or at the folklore department, or any of these things, and there are so many records, and I think sometimes we forget, there are so many records that are not digitized. They're never going to be. I know that when I was at the archives for the various Roman Catholic churches, I could transcribe anything I wanted to, but you can't photograph it, you can't make a copy of it, and they're not going to make it available. So sometimes, finding those really old records was a process of sitting down with a priest's book and reading through the records and then transcribing it, knowing that maybe 5 other people had done it, and that's going to be the only way you're going to find the really old records. But it's possible. Now it's more expensive, and our hobbies, this hobby does get expensive over time unless you're just using online sources. And you kind of have to focus on an area at a time and choose the place that's going to get you the most information, I think. And for me, that was Newfoundland, and then the other place that I'd be interested in is pockets of the United States.
Just something Tessa said sparked a memory for me of while I was in the Norfolk Record Office last week. They have a long gallery that you walk through to get in there, and they have an exhibition there pretty much all the time. And one of the really exciting things is that this exhibition was about pre-parish register records, and really exciting development is that there's some old manorial court records which are in bundles, and they almost daren't unwrap them. There is brand new technology now. They can X-ray these things and turn it into flat copy. And once you can X-ray a wound-up document that's hundreds of years old and damp and musty, and you don't want to play with it, you can actually X-ray it and turn what's in the middle of that back into text. It's absolutely phenomenal, very exciting stuff, and it's coming our way soon.
Right, thank you all very much. It just leaves me the privilege of summing up. So I'll let you read those. I'm pretty much preaching to the choir here, aren't I? It's the top piece of advice. Enjoy your hobby. Not take it too seriously. It doesn't matter whether you do it one way or t'other, as long as you recognise there are pros and cons to each approach. Taking a slightly different approach at times can be a lot more fun. So, Without any further ado, I'd just basically like to say thank you to Tessa. Sorry I couldn't get you up on the screen. Thanks for getting up so early on the west coast of the US.
It was my pleasure.
And that was just for you, Tessa. I hope you heard that.
Okay, great.
And to the fellow panelists, the locals, they've asked me that if you've got any particular questions for them, could you write them down on a £10 note and bring them forward?
As are euros.